Considering the average career span of a Major League ball player is about 5.5 years, it's quite rare to find a player be active in parts of 4 different decades. But it's happened, and that's what we're here to talk about. I'm also strictly discussing players who played 4 decades in the major leagues, so minor leagues, Negro leagues, and other foreign leagues don't count. Sorry, Satchel. For a player to make this list, they've had to have made at least one appearance in 4 different decades, not have a career that spanned that long as a player. An example of someone who does not make this list is Charlie O'Leary. O'Leary was a shortstop who played from 1904 to 1913, where he then became a coach until 1937. However, in 1934, at the age of 58, O'Leary came out of retirement to make one pinch hitting appearance, managing to single and later score. While his playing career technically did span 4 decades, he failed to play in the 1920s and cannot make the claim to play in 4 decades. Baseball players can have long careers, but being able to play in 4 decades is luck-based too. A player has to be relatively young when making his debut, which has to occur at the end of a decade. For example, Pete Rose played 24 seasons in the major leagues, but he is not part of this list. He played from 1963 to 1986. While Willie McCovey, who played 2 seasons fewer than Pete Rose, is on this list. He played from 1959 to 1980. As of 2018, there have only been 29 MLB players who've played in parts of 4 decades. That's only 6 more than the number of perfect games. Of that small group of players, 11 are in the Hall of Fame, with the possibility of a 12th if Omar Vizquel gets inducted, as he's the most recent to join the exclusive club. Speaking of Vizquel, Omar became the first shortstop to play in parts of 4 decades when he took the field on April 9, 2010 for the White Sox. Despite only making 9 appearances at shortstop that year for Chicago, he still became the first man ever to appear in a major league game as a shortstop in parts of 4 decades. Vizquel was the last man to do it, with the first 2 men being Jim O'Rourke and Dan Brothers. They both achieved that status when they played in 1904, both for the New York Giants. Yes, you heard that right, it's 1904, not 1900. Here's why. O'Rourke last played in 1896, and Brothers last played in 1893, but both came back for 1 season for the Giants in 1904. Fun fact, O'Rourke only played in 1 game in 1904, and Brothers only played in 2 games that year. Whether it's 1 game or 1,000 games, the achievement still counts, and both those players became the first 2 to do it. Let's look at all the players who have appeared in 4 different decades. Jim O'Rourke, Dan Brothers, Kate Gleason, Deacon McGuire, Jack O'Connor, Jack Ryan, Nick Altrock, Eddie Collins, Jack Quinn, Bobo Newsom, Mickey Verman, Ted Williams, Early Wynn, Minnie Minoso, Jim Cott, Tim McCarver, Willie McCovey, Bill Buckner, Rick Dempsey, Carlton Fisk, Jerry Reese, Nolan Ryan, Ricky Henderson, Mike Morgan, Jesse Orozco, Tim Raines, Ken Griffey Jr., Jamie Moyer, and Omar Vizquel. Ever since the first 2 players played in 4 decades, every decade debut has seen at least 1 player play in 4 decades, except for 1. By that, I mean at least 1 player to make his debut in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and every other decade following went on to have a 4-decade career except for the 1910s. No player who debuted in the 1910s would go on to play in parts of 4 decades. 1 player came close, Jimmy Dykes. He debuted in 1918 and played through the 1939 season. Dykes would actually go on to become the first manager ever to win 1,000 games without ever reaching the playoffs, most notably managing the White Sox. We've discussed players playing in 4 decades, but what about baseball players playing in parts of 5 decades? Is that even possible? Surprisingly, there have been 2. Nick Altrock and Minnie Minoso. Altrock is an interesting case. He played 1 season in the 1890s and just 2 games in the 1930s, with a single at-bat in both 1931 and 1933, being 57 years old at the time of his last at-bat. What is it with these players appearing in single games for 1 season? It's as if they came back just to be able to play in a fourth, or in this case, fifth decade. In fact, all Truck's last 4 play appearances came in 4 different years, spanning a 10-season stretch, coming to the plate just once in 1924, 1929, 1931, and 1933. Minoso became the first black player in White Sox history, and the first black Cuban player ever to play Major League Baseball. He was one of the top offensive hitters of his time, broke multiple White Sox records, and placed in the top 5 in MVP voting 4 times. Minoso retired after the 1964 season, but joined the White Sox as a coach in 1976. It was that year, at the age of 50, Minnie made 8 appearances as a batter and even got a hit off of Angels pitcher Sid Monge. He also had 2 pinch-hitting appearances 4 years later in 1980, but failed to record a hit. However, it is these 2 at-bats Minoso had that gives him the claim as one of the 2 players to ever appear in 5 decades of Major League Baseball. So, what does the future hold for us? Who will be baseball's next 4-decade player? Will we even see a player who debuted in the 1990s play in 4 decades? As of the end of the 2018 season, there were only 2 active players left who were also active in the 90s, Adrian Beltre and Bartolo Colon. After multiple injuries, Beltre elected to retire following the season, leaving Bartolo Colon as the last man standing. There are doubts about if Colon can do it. He has expressed interest in wanting to play in 2019, but he'll be turning 46 in May of this year. Not to mention, he has to make at least 1 appearance next year in 2020 to play in 4 decades. He would be almost 47 years old at the time of his 4th decade debut. Although still over a decade away, there is a small group of players who've debuted in the 2000s I believe have a shot of playing into the 2030s. That group consists of Clayton Kershaw, Madison Bumgarner, Rick Porcello, and Elvis Andrus. If there will be any 4-decade player who played from the 2000s to the 2030s, it would most likely be one of them. Although, we'll just have to wait and find out.